If the Germans had anxiety over the prospect of fighting a war on multiple fronts, then I hate to think about the level of stress Austria-Hungary must have gone through during this period. Once the champion of diplomacy on the continent, the Habsburg regime had become one of the most hated, backward empires in the world. The Russian Empire came to their aid dealing with the Hungarian Revolt of 1848. However, Austria-Hungary did not return the favour in the Crimean War of 1853. Since then, tensions had existed between the two powers and could have escalated into war at any moment. To the north, they had the new German Empire, a nation they lost a humiliating war to in 1866. To the south, the Balkans, this land they wanted for themselves, but it was not as easy to invade as it would appear. The Balkan states, like they did against the Ottoman Empire and then Bulgaria, would likely unite against Austria-Hungary if they tried anything too overly aggressive. In addition, later, many in Serbia wanted to form a new Serb kingdom, claiming it as their right, which included lands in the empire. And then their final neighbour, the newly formed Italy. They also shared a history of wars with. Perhaps this is something they could have gotten over, but they shared an interest in the Balkans, and this led to a rivalry. So it must have came as a lifesaver to them when Otto von Bismarck of the German Empire proposed the League of the Three Emperors. As the treaty's intent was to keep the peace and maintain the balance of power, whilst also preventing revolts from occupied cultures, it was a defensive treaty. Article 1 stated that if any great power outside of the treaty was to attack one of the three emperors, then the other two emperors must come to that emperor's aid. Article 2 states that they had to approach the situation in the Balkans peacefully, through common agreement between all parties. Interestingly, even back in 1873, they believed the Balkans would be the catalyst for a major war. Other clauses go as follows. Firstly, Bosnia and Herzegovina's occupation and eventual annexation by Austria-Hungary would be recognised and accepted by Russia. Secondly, this treaty in its exact form must be kept secret for as long as it is in effect. The treaty never came to much, however, and fell apart in 1878 over a territorial dispute in the Balkans. Many uprisings kick-started within the Ottoman Empire. Russia was called in as protector of all Orthodox Slavs to help them in this unification war. This led to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. Russia won decisively, yet fearing a powerful Russia in the Balkans, Austria-Hungary and Britain met in the Congress of Berlin with Bismarck in 1878. Here it was decided that much of the fruits of Russian victory were not to go to Russia at all, granting the land instead to the newly independent Balkan states. This was made worse by Austria-Hungary's occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Britain's of Cyprus. Russia felt that they had won the war, yet lost the diplomatic game. Germany had a choice, side with Austria-Hungary or side with Russia, and they chose the former. Russia was furious after their victory was stolen from them by the two great powers they had allied only half a decade prior. They felt betrayed, and an anti-German sentiment spread across the country. Although arguably unfair on Russia, Article 2, mentioned earlier, made what Germany and Austria-Hungary did legal. The treaty fell apart. 3 years later, 1881, the agreement was renewed in secret, but this fell apart again in 1887 due to yet another Balkan-related issue, the Bulgarian crisis. With the League now a failure, Germany came back to Austria-Hungary and proposed a simpler dual alliance. The dual alliance was created in 1879 and served as a defensive pact between the two. Its particular focus and reason for existence was to counter Russia. If Russia attacked one ally, the other must come to their aid. In addition, if one ally was to be attacked by a power other than Russia, then the other ally must remain neutral. It was an anti-Russian treaty. This was followed by a secret alliance from Serbia in 1881 and again with Romania in 1883, which brought them under Austro-Hungarian protection. Austria-Hungary was not a fan, however, of the German foreign policy of attempting to isolate France. In 1887 there was risk they may not have renewed the alliance, but Bismarck threatened to withdraw protection against Russia if Austria-Hungary did not re-sign. Austria-Hungary re-signed. This shows a lot about the Empire's goals in foreign policy. Peace with Russia was on the forefront of their minds. This eastern rival was their primary fear, and it drove them to so much anxiety that others were able to use it against them to get their own way. In addition, Count Gustav Kalnacki was chosen as the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister. The Count used to be the ambassador at St. Petersburg. His contacts and relations with Russia were already in place, making him the perfect candidate at understanding how to deal with Russia. Meanwhile, their involvement in the Balkans was not raw, brutal conquest, as it could have been in the past. Instead, they opted for a more diplomatic solution, focusing on spheres of influence and power projection, to make the Balkan states reliant upon them. This is why they agreed to the Serbian alliance, and eventually made agreements with Romania. Through this, they could diminish Russian power in the Balkans, and have the region under their influence. The King of Serbia, Alexander, was assassinated, and Serbia was taken over by the more nationalistic side of the monarchy. Their alliance with Austria-Hungary broke down. Austria-Hungary then used the power of influence and applied economic pressure. This led to the Pig War. The Serbian export of pigs were forbidden from being traded into Austria-Hungary, hurting them economically, but turning them instead to the open arms of France and therefore their ally, Russia. By this point, a new diplomat was in charge. Under his guidance, Bosnia and Herzegovina were annexed, which led to the Bosnian crisis, further souring their relations with Russia and Serbia. Austria-Hungary's weak internal structure began to join with their weak foreign policy. The Czechs within the empire formed a Pan-Slav Congress in Prague, which took the side of the Serbs. Austria-Hungary had to impose martial law to bring the region back under control. The situation worsened overall. A national consensus proved that in the Austrian part of the empire, 60% viewed themselves as Slavic, compared to the 36% German-Austrian. By this point, diplomats of the empire felt sure a war with Serbia would come. In addition, the Austro-Hungarian Chief of Staff, Franz Konrad von Hötzendorf, was known as a warmonger and was even pushing for a preventative war against Italy and Serbia, but did not follow through as they could not guarantee the support of Germany. Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in June 1914, triggering the July crisis. An ultimatum was sent to Serbia as they blamed the Serbian government, and the backing from Germany was accepted. Serbia refused the ultimatum, and so Austria-Hungary declared war. Lastly, I want to ask a question. Very hypothetical, but important to the subject. Let's say 1916, 2 years of fighting. The Emperor takes command of the Austro-Hungarian army. Suddenly, the whole nation fights with an incredible degree of success on all fronts and shake the world with their clear domination in the First World War. They instantly take the Balkans, storm over the Alps, seizing the Italian north. and then push straight through into the undefended region of southern France, all the while making a heroic push onto Moscow. With a Central Powers victory and Austria-Hungary holding the largest seat at the peace conference, what would they demand? Of course, this is ridiculous. This is not alternate history, just a simple thought experiment to explain Austria-Hungary's foreign policy during the war. If Austria-Hungary led the charge and was victorious, then I would not be too surprised if they did not just straight up occupy all of Serbia between themselves and Bulgaria. Reason being, they would have likely wanted to remove all of Serbia out of fear of their nationalistic propaganda. By removing the external threat, you help to neutralise the internal threat from their own Slavic population. In my opinion, in some normal alternate history, where the Central Powers won, but with Austria-Hungary still overshadowed by Germany, then they may have had to become more of a constitutional monarchy, or a United States of Austria, just to maintain stability. However, in this timeline, for the sake of seeing national ambitions and foreign policy play out, I think the extra prestige the monarchy would have gained out of being the main dominant power would have cemented the empire together, and they would have likely fixed their instability issues for the time being. This segment is not about judging what could logically have happened. It's just about understanding what they wanted through a thought experiment. Despite this, however, I don't think they would have been wildly expansionist after this. Germany would prove to take vast swathes of land away from Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But Germany was mostly German and had enough room to bring in new cultures under their occupation. Austria-Hungary, on the other hand, despite their extra prestige and stability, probably would not have wanted to add too many more foreign cultures into their already overly complicated empire. Montenegro and Albania would likely have become puppet states instead. They would likely want to see a return of some small borderlands from Romania. Perhaps the rest of Romania, after Bulgaria takes their share, may have been puppeted, cementing Austro-Hungarian hegemony in the Balkans. I don't think they would take much from Italy. At the end of the day, their own issue with the Italians really was the conflict of interest they shared in the Balkans and the Adriatic. I see potential for Italy to drop its claims and ambitions in the Balkans, and the Italian-cultured areas as well within the empire. Finalised by the two agreeing to some pact of friendship, taking land would just reinstigate the Italian urge for unification and create more unrest. If they did take land, however, then I doubt they will go any further than releasing Venezia as a puppet. The third matter to settle is the Russian Empire. In our time, the Bolsheviks took control. However, as this video is not a what-if alternate history, and is instead a thought experiment to discover what they wanted pre-war, we would have to assume the Tsar remained in power, and Russia did not break apart internally. Austria-Hungary would have likely divided the Russians in Europe, perhaps releasing new nations as puppets, rather than take any land directly. Again, they have enough problems with foreign cultures internally as it is. Along with gains into Russia from Germany and the Ottomans, it is likely at this point Austria-Hungary would feel comfortable along that border. That's what it was about, neutralising the Russian threat, not becoming Russia. Finally, with heavy reparations being paid from the other great powers into the hands of the empire, it is likely this would have heavily funded industrialisation and would transform Austria-Hungary into a modern state. However, I believe this industrialisation would have taken place mostly in the Austrian part at first, to give higher value to the Austrian-German percentage of the population. Despite these gains, however, I would argue Austria-Hungary's position and actions to be deeply rooted in defensive measures, and I cannot envisage them being as expansionist as Germany would have been in this same scenario. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed and learnt something. If you did, please like the video and share with anyone else you think may be interested. Subscribe for more. We are next going to cover the German Empire. This has been the history of diplomacy.